Peak Trump, The Undrainable Swamp and the Fantasy of MAGA, written by David A. Stockman, narrated by Russell Newton. Copyright 2019 by Contra Corner Press. Production copyright by Spoken Tome Media. You need to hear this. Peak Trump happened on September 20th, 2018, when the S&P 500's giant bubble topped out at 2,941. It's been downhill for the market ever since then, and with much more meltdown to go, it means that the Donald, too, is heading for a great big fall. Indeed, we think the odds that he'll be accorded the Dick Nixon Memorial Helicopter ride to Gainesville before the end of his term are, once again, not inconsiderable and are rising ineluctably. That's because, at the end of the day, the Donald is not remotely the force of nature he's been made to seem by the Trump-obsessed media. To the contrary, he's a political flyweight, megalomaniacal, incompetent, and bile-ridden bully who stumbled into the Oval Office against all odds, and then lucked out a second time by riding high on the final 2-year crest of a deeply impaired and unsustainable economic recovery cycle and monumental stock market bubble. So doing, however, the Donald committed the most egregious rookie mistake in the history of the American presidency. That is, he insouciantly embraced the financial bubble that was destined to crash and took ownership of a struggling, geriatric business cycle expansion that had recession ahead written all over its forehead. Even on purely mechanical, calendarized basis, Trump's embrace of the current economy was sheer folly. By January 2017, the weakest and most artificial business expansion in American history was already 90 months old. It thereby stood barely a year shy of the legendary 1960s guns and butter expansion, 105 months, and it was also just 29 months from the all-time record expansion of the 1990s tech boom, 119 months. But unlike today, the late stages of the 1990s cycle had benefited from immense tailwinds, which implied there was plenty of juice to keep the expansion going. For example, Uncle Sam was running a 2% of GDP budget surplus by the year 2000, which obviated any upward pressure on interest rates or tendency for U.S. Treasury borrowing to squeeze out private investment. Likewise, the Fed's balance sheet stood at only $500 billion versus $4.5 trillion at the recent peak. Accordingly, there was no urgent need back then to throw on the monetary brakes, and in fact, there still existed immense headroom to stimulate demand if needs be. Overseas, the tailwinds were equally strong. The red Ponzi was just then bursting out of the starting blocks and had not yet buried itself in debt, malinvestment, and fevered speculation. Also, at the turn of the century, a newly energized single-currency Europe was fixing to temporarily borrow and spend like there was no tomorrow. Notwithstanding these powerful tailwinds, of course, the hideously inflated dot-com and tech bubbles splattered during the course of 2000 and after, eventually sending the Main Street economy into recession in the spring of 2001. Nor was that abrupt end to the longest business cycle expansion in history a one-off aberration. As we elaborate below, the 83% crash of the NASDAQ 100 during 2000 to 2002, and lesser but still severe declines in the S&P 500 and Russell 2000 small cap index, marked a wholly new trigger sequence for recessions in the age of Fed-driven bubble finance. To wit, recessions now originate in crashing Wall Street bubbles, not in the retrenchment of household and business credit on Main Street, as was historically the case. Needless to say, by the lights of his own correct campaign rhetoric, Trump inherited a dot-com scale financial bubble, but no macroeconomic tailwinds whatsoever. In fact, the Main Street economy was struggling in the midst of an aging, artificial recovery that had been kept alive after the September 2008 financial meltdown only by means of $10 trillion of public borrowing and a spree of Fed money printing and negative real interest rates that had no parallel in prior history or even a reference in any known economic textbook. In that context, nobody with an ounce of economic comprehension, or even in possession of a well-crafted, shovel-ready economic recovery program, would have dreamed that the wheezing, structurally incapacitated American economy of January 2017 could be successfully repaired on the short remaining cyclical runway available. The apt metaphor about the great distance required to reverse the direction of an aircraft carrier on the open seas hardly captured the extent of the challenge. The Reagan formula ignored. In fact, under the far less daunting circumstances of January 1981, Ronald Reagan had long ago set the proper template. He never stopped blaming Jimmy Carter and the Democrats for the colossal mess he had inherited until after the ship of state had finally turned, with no inconsiderable help from Paul Volcker, in a sustainably positive direction, and he had been re-elected by a landslide in 1984. Needless to say, unlike the Gipper, the Donald had no time left, no plan, no economic comprehension, and no humility whatsoever. Within months of the inauguration, he pivoted from running against Obama's failed economy to celebrating an ostensible Trumpian boom that was nothing of the kind, and still isn't, as we document below. And that's why the Donald's fabulous 2-year ride on the cresting phase of the greatest financial bubble ever inflated by rogue central bankers and reckless Wall Street Momo chasers is coming to an abrupt end. The fact is, now that the support levels and safety ledges of the stock market's chart monkeys have all been taken out, its vulnerability to the next crash and the Main Street economy's exposure to the next recession is coming into sharp relief. As to the latter, the history books will record that the Donald never saw it coming. Owing to his impulsive, immense, and incorrigible ego, he's remained utterly blind to the fact that the unemployment rate always falls below 4% during the final months of a long economic expansion cycle. So, those monthly prints from the BLS weren't any kind of vindication at all of his tax cut, fiscal debauch, or his trade and border wars, or even his ballyhooed regulatory reforms, which mainly amounted to canceling prospective Obama regulatory schemes in the energy and environment areas that had not yet even taken effect. Indeed, taking credit for the falling headline U3 rate at the tail end of a business cycle is equivalent to claiming credit for the daily sunset. Likewise, a few random quarters of 3% plus economic growth had exactly nothing to do with MAGA. No Trumpian boom. Thus, the unemployment rate at month number 90 of the aforementioned business expansions, the two longest ones in modern history, was 3.7% and 4.5% respectively, compared to 4.8% when Trump took office. Moreover, during the remaining months of the 1960s and 1990s expansions, the headline unemployment rate dipped slightly lower to 3.5% and 3.9% respectively, but that's all she wrote. Both times, the U.S. economy succumbed to recession within months of hitting the U3 lows. Historically, therefore, sub-4% unemployment rates have actually been flashing red warning signs of trouble just around the bend. And this time, there was absolutely no reason to think otherwise, and every reason to expect the worst. Nevertheless, the Donald heedlessly and incessantly embraced the transient 3.7% unemployment rate as if it were all his doing, when it was actually a clanging warning bell to pull out the stops, blaming the swamp creatures of the imperial city for a fake boom that couldn't last. As we indicated, nowadays under the Fed's baleful regime of deep financial repression and cowardly coddling of the stock market, recessions are triggered by imploding financial bubbles, not the traditional catalyst of Main Street credit and economic retrenchment. For example, on the eve of the 2001 recession, the annualized real GDP growth rate had exceeded 4.0% for 16 successive quarters. Yet that didn't preclude an end to the business expansion shortly thereafter owing to the thundering collapse of the dot-com and tech bubbles. Likewise, in the new world of central bank-driven financialization, a few random quarters of 3.0% plus real GDP growth is nothing to write home about either. The failed Obama economy, in fact, had posted 11 quarters of greater than 3.0% annualized real GDP growth. But they didn't last, and owing to periodic reversals and stallouts, they averaged into the weakest recovery cycle growth rate by far in prior history. Indeed, by month number 90 of the present so-called recovery, the evidence of fundamental economic impairment was palpable. Donald Trump was inheriting an anemic U.S. economy where real GDP was still only 13% above its prior peak way back in Q4 2007. By contrast, at the same point in the 1990s recovery cycle, real GDP was up by 37% and had risen by 48% by the like point of the 1960s cycle. Beyond that, all the other post-war business cycles had already ended much earlier than month number 90. As the blue line in the chart dramatically underscores, the U.S. business cycle was living on borrowed time and faltering momentum the very hour that the Donald was sworn to office. In the context of that astonishing shortfall from all prior cycles, the Donald had no silver bullet at all, just an overweening ego that could not resist taking credit for the residual momentum of what was actually an unsustainably imbalanced economy. Even then, he embraced a great big economic nothing burger without a hint of awareness. The ballyhooed Trumpian Boom, in fact, was never comprised of much more than talking point spin and statistical cherry-picking. During the first 7 quarters on the Donald's watch, real final sales, GDP less inventory swings, have actually grown at just 2.69% per annum, and that's no material acceleration at all from Obama's final 11 quarters, when the growth rate had been 2.53%. Indeed, if there was ever a measure of the Trumpian delusion, the above-referenced 0.16% of statistically meaningless incremental growth is surely it. So loudly taking ownership of what candidate Trump had correctly called a big, fat, ugly bubble was not merely short-sighted and outright dumb. It was actually profoundly insulting to the left-behind voters of Flyover America who elected him. Flyover America betrayed. After all, they were the victims of today's rotten regime of mountainous public and private debt, relentless Fed money pumping, hideous Wall Street windfalls to the 1%, and the job and growth-destroying plunder of cash flows by the stock option-obsessed C-suites of corporate America. The Donald wouldn't have gotten within a country mile of the Oval Office had it not been for the desperation of those left-behind voters in the Rust Belt precincts of western Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa, where he squeaked through in the Electoral College. To redeem his MAGA promises, therefore, Trump needed to attack the fundamental causes of a failed Main Street economy, and failed was the word for it. Despite Wall Street's endless ballyhoo about tiny and often revised or reversible gains in the monthly incoming data, the big-picture trends told the true dismal story. To wit, there's been zero growth in the real median household income since the year 2000. The U.S. economy has generated virtually no new full-pay, full-time breadwinner jobs for 18 years. The so-called recovery from the Great Recession, which was so anemic that there still has been no net gain in manufacturing output since November 2007, and, most crucially, a gargantuan $800 billion trade deficit has consigned vast stretches of Flyover America to be offshored, hollowed out, and left to flounder. Needless to say, the common cause of Main Street's economic malaise wasn't a sudden failing of capitalism at home or an onslaught of imports, immigrants, and nefarious trade machinations by governments aboard. In fact, it was the handiwork of Imperial Washington and the self-serving consensus of its bipartisan ruling class in favor of permanent war, unchained welfare entitlements, fiscal incontinence, unsustainable debt-fueled household spending, rampant corporate financial engineering, and Keynesian monetary repression and wealth effects central planning at the Fed. So, with the markets now retreating from the final spasmodic swelling of the giant bubble he inherited, the question recurs as to whether the Donald has begun to fix anything at all, or has he even laid a glove on any of the fundamental causes of America's baleful economic predicament. Trump's mission accomplished. Disruption, not remediation. As we shall demonstrate in the chapters which follow, the answer is not even a close call. He's done neither, and in accordance with his real mission as the Great Disruptor, has actually made matters inestimably worse with his misbegotten trade wars, border wars, Fed bashing, and fiscal debauch. Even his much welcome but furtive tilt toward a primitive version of America First foreign policy has mostly been stymied, smothered, and sabotaged by the deep state incumbents who continue to run the government. And that's been abetted, in no small measure, by the phalanx of failed generals and neocon interventionists that Trump has unaccountably installed in key offices. On that score, in fact, the Donald has essentially deep-sixed his own parade. His promise to march from the far-flung follies of Empire First to a more modest and inward-looking notion of America First has already been largely derailed at his own hand. That's because the desperately needed pivot to fiscal and national security sanity was stopped cold by the Donald's mindless $100 billion per year boost of an already vastly excessive and waste-ridden national defense budget. And now that crucial pivot has been further blocked by a reckless economic and political war against Iran that will do exactly nothing to further the security and safety of the American homeland. Moreover, by feeding the massive warfare state budget, which already totals over $1 trillion per year when you add in the cost of foreign operations, military and economic aid, Homeland Security and the due bills for past wars represented by interest on war bonds and veterans' benefits. $200 billion per year. Trump has precluded any possibility of fiscal discipline. Here we are, referring to the twin fiscal menace of the warfare state and the welfare state, and the iron law of their expansion. To wit, whenever the former is being ramped upwards at full tilt, the warhawk and neocon-dominated GOP is put out of business on the fiscal retrenchment front, meaning there is no legislative coalition that can possibly arrest the drift of what amounts to a fiscal doomsday machine. Moreover, in the current instance, that iron law of fiscal expansion was never in doubt, because the Donald himself took entitlements off the table by foolishly pledging to never touch the $2 trillion per year Social Security Medicare monster that lies at the heart of the federal budget. Trump then added insult to injury via his unfunded $1.7 trillion tax cut and massive defense and domestic spending increases. All told, the result was a guaranteed $20 trillion explosion of the federal debt over the coming decade. Moreover, this Trumpian fiscal debauch could not have occurred at a worse time. To wit, it came at the tail end of the business cycle when fiscal retrenchment is supposed to occur, and also at the point where the Fed had belatedly begun to extract itself from the impossible corner into which it had painted itself. Notwithstanding the barbs from the Oval Office and the lame pleadings of the Wall Street brats who believed they're entitled to an endlessly rising stock market, the Fed has actually reached a point of desperation where replenishing its dry powder has become a matter of institutional self-preservation. What we mean is that the Keynesian apparatchiks who inhabit the Eccles building recognize their untrammeled power to dominate the entire financial system directly, and the U.S. economy indirectly, is now at stake. That's because its open-ended remit depends upon the Fed's ability to function as a recession-fighting savior after economic downturns, even when such Main Street setbacks are invariably caused by its own misbegotten policies. Accordingly, having dithered and delayed the process of normalization for years, it must now restore interest rates to a level which affords the FOMC something to cut in the next crisis, And it must likewise shrink its balance sheet substantially in order to recoup headroom to expand once the next recession inevitably hits. So, regardless of whether the Fed pauses on the previously scheduled 2 or 3 interest rate increases in 2019, we believe it will continue to shrink its balance sheet at an unprecedented $600 billion annual rate. And that's where the Trumpian fantasy of MAGA will come a cropper. Why the MAGA fantasy will come a cropper? The bond pits will need to absorb $1.2 trillion of new federal borrowing and $600 billion of existing bonds being dumped by the Fed during the current fiscal year, and far, far larger amounts in the years thereafter, and as far as the eye can see. But that's not going to happen at a sub 3.00% yield on the 10-year Treasury. Not in a million years. Stated differently, crunch time is coming to the casino, and that's what is sure to bring the Donald down. The stock market is heading not only for another 50% correction, 1,500 on the S&P, but also toward a long L-shaped bottom rather than the quick V-shaped rebound which occurred after 2009. That's because the Fed and other central banks are so far behind the curve that they have virtually no possibility of truly normalizing monetary conditions before the third and most unstable and unwarranted financial bubble of this century finally splatters all over the casino. And that will surely transpire, because the Fed foolishly pegged the money market rate to the zero bound for 7 straight years, from December 2008 to December 2015. In fact, with only a handful of monthly exceptions, the federal funds rate has been well below the annual inflation rate for 108 months running. That means money market rates have been negative in real terms for nearly a decade. Yet negative carry costs are the mother's milk of speculation on Wall Street, and this time the Fed has fueled a full decade of exactly that. It's why the casino is chock-a-block with financial explosive devices, FEDs, from stem to stern. 9 years of negative real interest rates. So, as these reckless and interconnected bets continue to unwind, sometimes violently so, the Fed and other central banks will be impotent to arrest the carnage. In part, that's because the magnitude of bottled-up speculation in the financial system after 7 years on the zero bound and nearly 9 years of negative real interest rates simply dwarfs the buildups which previously occurred during the dot-com tech bubble and the Greenspan housing and credit bubble. During those bubble expansions, the Fed had pegged the funds rate at a far higher bottom, and then for only a few quarters, not 9 years, as is evident in the chart. Worse still, before each of the 2 prior stock crash-triggered recessions, the Fed got the money market rate up and reloaded for cuts well before the crash incepted. Thus, the Eccles building ratcheted the funds rate to 6.50% more than a year before the dot-com recession incepted in March 2001, and had ratcheted it up to 5.25% nearly 2 years before the Lehman meltdown of September 2008. Accordingly, it was able to goose Wall Street with a 550 basis point reduction in the cost of carry trade speculation after the 2001 recession and cyclical bottom, and, likewise, to slash the Fed funds rate by 525 basis points down to zero after the 2008 meltdown and recession. To be sure, slashing the overnight money rates on Wall Street did exactly nothing for Flyover America's deeply indebted households, but it was a godsend to Wall Street speculators. It enabled the latter to fund their positions directly with nearly zero-cost repo or unsecured credit, or indirectly through the implicit carry trades available on the options market or at the bespoke trading desks of the Wall Street prime dealers. What this meant, of course, is that the Fed deployed massive firepower on both occasions to artificially and hyper-aggressively force a robust reflation of asset prices in the casino. When combined with massive QE in 2008 and 2009 especially, the result was a drastic V-shaped rebound of the stock averages that erased entirely all of the losses and lessons imposed on speculators and leverage-based momentum traders by the Great Financial Crisis, GFC. The GFC, in fact, was the most terribly wasted crisis in modern financial history. The capital and money markets were not disciplined or repaired, but quickly reverted to a full-on casino-style modus operandi. And the fatally debt-encumbered Main Street economy was not really deleveraged one bit. Combined household and non-financial business debt today stands at $30.5 trillion, compared to $24.3 trillion at the 2007 pre-crisis peak. Self-evidently, with the federal funds rate still encapsulated in the red-circled normalcy range, there will be no 525 basis points of rate slashing available to goose Wall Street into a pell-mell reflation of financial asset prices this time around the barn. Instead, the casino will twist and turn at the bottom. That's especially true because this time there's also drastically more bottled-up inflation in financial asset prices than there was at the 2000 and 2007 tops. So, the impending unwind of nearly a decade of rampant carry trade speculation will be unusually violent and deep. And in the absence of Fed money market rate slashing capacity, also unusually long-lasting. This stock market shock, in turn, will trigger another Wall Street-style recession in which desperate C-suites toss jobs, inventories, and restructuring charges overboard with reckless abandon in a futile attempt to appease the trading gods and rescue their evaporating stock options. Once again, of course, Flyover America will bear the brunt of recession, and that will elicit a renewed wave of dislocation, demoralization, and sense of betrayal among the Trumpian base. Indeed, if the Donald had even remotely grasped the financial time bombs he was inheriting, he would have attacked the Wall Street speculators from day number one and aggressively house-cleaned the Fed as their culpable handmaid and enabler. Needless to say, the Donald chose to puff up his chest and thrust it directly into harm's way instead. So, when the heavy shoe of a collapsing stock market and recessionary economy hits the pavement, it'll be all over for his 2-year joyride. Trump's 2016 electoral base was always fragile and reflective of what amounted to a political Hail Mary by the disenfranchised millions who voted for him in the burned-out and left-behind counties and precincts of Flyover America. But when the U.S. economy lapses into another downturn and the MAGA myth is visibly rebuked and eviscerated, the Donald's patented immigrant bashing and border and trade war rhetoric won't cut it. Donald Trump, like Richard Nixon before him, will find himself home alone in the Oval Office, with the hinterlands betrayed, the GOP defenders silenced, and the imperial city thirsting for the kill. No cigar for CNN. Nevertheless, let us be clear. It is the impending hammer of financial collapse and economic retreat that will be the Donald's undoing, not the long-running CNN, MSN political indictment. And it's the pending assault on the paychecks of the voters and the bank accounts of the Republican donors which will awaken the GOP polls from their one-eye-open slumber and mobilize them to defenestrate the Donald. That's not to say, of course, that the endless anti-Trump bloviation of the mainstream media's talking heads and their collaborators among the friend and foe alike, and has thereby badly diminished America's global leadership. But, ironically, that will surely remain his lasting and likely only accomplishment. What we mean is that the ruination of prosperity and liberty in America by Imperial Washington has no hope of surcease until the latter declares a war, occupation, or intervention, and no one shows up for the party. That outcome, at least, the Donald has pretty much guaranteed. Still, more than anything else, the Donald's fluke elevation to the Oval Office has finally caused the deep state to come out of hiding and bare its fangs against American democracy itself. So doing, it has awakened the sleepwalkers of the foxified right about the immense dangers of the warfare state and the sweeping surveillance and police state apparatus that's been created in the service of the neocons' misbegotten war on terrorism and quest for empire. In a word, the terrifying capabilities, resources, and purported credibility of the nation's $75 billion per year intelligence community were hijacked by top Obama officials led then by CIA Director John Brennan in furtherance of a plot to first forestall Trump's election and then to relitigate the outcome and eviscerate his presidency after the voters had spoken. No greater threat has ever been mounted against America's constitutional democracy than the plain-as-day collusion of Brennan, Rice, Comey, Clapper, Yates, McCabe, Rosenstein, Schrock, Page et al. To thwart the will of the electorate. That deep state assault, incepted in the utterly unjustified investigation of Russian influences on the Trump campaign during July 2016, became blatantly overt in the crude Comey-Yates entrapment ploy against General Flynn on the eve of Trump's inauguration, and then went full-on public, seizing the Justice Department's investigative and law enforcement machinery via the Mueller special counsel appointment in order to conduct an abusive, bare-knuckled witch hunt against the president and any and all bystanders who could be used to discredit his incumbency. Needless to say, the mainstream media is so caught up in the anti-Trump mania fomented by the imperial city's ruling classes and partisan shills that the main fact of the attempted coup by the deep state has been completely muffled. Indeed, this very real, homegrown case of election meddling by the intelligence and law enforcement agencies of the American state has been virtually covered in spray paint by CNN and the rest of the MSM via the Russia-Trump collusion counter-narrative. Yet, the latter is so preposterous and threadbare as to virtually force the ultimate question. Namely, given the fact that Russia's GDP is just 7% of that of the U.S., and that Washington's defense spending is 12 times greater than the Kremlin's, how in the world can rationally thinking adults view Russia as any threat whatsoever to the security and safety of the American homeland? To say nothing of the implied existential threat embodied in the current anti-Kremlin fulminations. The RussiaGate hoax, a form of Washington bereavement ritual. There's a simple answer, of course, and it's not about the Kremlin's threat to national security or even the silly social media clickbaiting efforts of a pint-sized St. Petersburg troll farm operated during the 2016 election by a second-tier Russian oligarch and a nationalist agitator. In fact, if Russia didn't exist, the imperial city would have needed to revive Orwell's enemy states of Eurasia or Eastasia. That's because the Dem Party and the Washington establishment have been so traumatized and rebuked by losing to a buffoon like Donald Trump that they have embraced a virtually fictionalized Russian meddling story to explain the November 2016 outcome. For them, RussiaGate has apparently become a form of bereavement ritual. Indeed, without the implicit postulate that Trump could not have won the presidency without massive and decisive external intervention, the bare facts of the Russian meddling story fall on their own face. In this context, there's also something slightly more. However he got there, candidate Trump, and to a lesser extent President Trump, never bought into the imperial city's post-2012 anti-Putin narrative for the utterly rational reason that it's unwarranted. The real Putin, as opposed to the imperial city's cartoon caricature, is a completely sober and rational nationalist leader of the semi-impoverished rump state of Russia. The notion that he's an expansionist aggressor and mini-Hitler in the making is just the latest invention of Imperial Washington, which desperately needs a foreign enemy to justify its $1 trillion annual fleecing of America's taxpayers, current and unborn. In this instance, the actual truth is more nearly the opposite. It was Washington's aggressive expansion of NATO to Russia's very borders, and its financing and recognition of the Ukrainian nationalist crypto-Nazi coup on the streets of Kiev in February 2014, which forced Putin to take defense actions. Even then, it was limited to accommodating the overwhelming desire of the Russian-speaking population of Crimea to return to Mother Russia, which it had been an integral part of for 171 years, rather than being ruled by the hostile political parties which seized power in Kiev. The war party's phony case against alleged Russian aggression. The same was true of Putin's limited support for the Russian-speaking population of the Donbas, eastern Ukraine. It takes only a surface knowledge of the blood-soaked history of the region to understand why the Russian speakers there took up arms against Kiev after the 2014 nationalist Nazi coup. The 1930s Stalinization of the Donbas iron, steel, coal, chemical, engineering, and armament sectors essentially moved reliable Russians into the factories and towns, and, in the process, liquidated or sent to Siberia Ukrainian nationalists and other political dissidents who didn't cotton to Uncle Joe's reform of socialist dystopia. Soon thereafter came the World War II battles, which pitted Ukrainian collaborators with Hitler's Wehrmacht against the Russified locals. In the first instance, the former conducted a scorched earth march through the Donbas on the way to Stalingrad. Then, when the Battle of Stalingrad was won, the Red Army retaliated in kind against the Ukrainian collaborators during its equally destructive march back through Ukraine on its way to Germany. So, exactly what dog did the American people have in that hunt? Obviously, the safety and security of the homeland was not impacted a whit by an unnecessary reopening of the Ukraine's bloody modern history. That's especially true since the current fight between Kiev and the Russian-speaking eastern provinces was owing to Washington's after-the-fact meddling in the country's 2010 election, which resulted in the deposing of its duly elected president by a Washington-funded street mob. Besides, the Ukraine for centuries has been a Russian vassal and set of meandering borders looking for a country. In that context, Washington's ridiculous demand that Crimea be returned to Ukraine is downright laughable. Crimea was never part of the Ukraine after it was purchased for good money from the Ottomans by Catherine the Great in 1783. The return in question amounts to Washington's insistence on enforcing the dead hand of the Soviet Presidium, which transferred Crimea to the Ukrainian Socialist Republic in 1954 as part of Khrushchev's consolidation of power after Stalin's death. It may well be that the candidate Trump didn't know all the ins and outs of this history and Washington's phony demonization of Putin and Russia. Then again, he wasn't house-trained by the war party either, and he had enough common sense to see that rapprochement with Russia was the number one priority. If his inchoate desire to reorient U.S. foreign policy to an America First standard was to gain any traction at all. Yet, that is also the very reason why the whole groundless Russia collusion narrative got traction in the first place. To wit, the imperial Washington groupthink was so invested in demonization of Putin and in the risible exaggeration of the Russian threat that Trump's rejection of the war party line was taken as proof that the Russians had something on him. Stated differently, the entire Mueller witch hunt rested on the blind proposition that the Kremlin had blackmail because there was purportedly no other possible basis for Trump's Russia-friendly position, or for even such minor common-sense steps as removing from the GOP platform the neocons' idiotic proposal to supply the Kiev government with lethal arms. Needless to say, Mueller's legal thugs have not found a sliver of evidence to support the collusion blackmail predicate because Trump's pro-rapprochement position rested all along on common sense, not nefarious doings. But what the whole deep state coup has accomplished is something quite lethal for American democracy. To wit, it has opened up a no-holds-barred war between two dangerous statist factions in the imperial city. On the one hand, the anti-Trumpers have already seized the machinery of state to nullify the democratic process. Apart from the fact that candidate Trump defied the imperial city's anti-Kremlin policy line, no honest custodian of the national intelligence machinery would have ever opened up the FBI investigation of the Trump campaign in July 2016 based on the ultra-thin gruel available. And that's to say nothing of obtaining a FISA warrant to wiretap the campaign headquarters of the Republican candidate for president. Those actions were massively beyond the pale. After all, the target of suspicion was Carter Page, a complete no-count, who was a mere campaign volunteer and had never even met Donald Trump. Likewise, the FISA warrant was based on the hideous Clinton-paid-for dossier and the drunken musings of baby George Papadopoulos, who was an even more peripheral figure in the campaign than Carter Page. In an honest democracy, Comey, Clapper, or Brennan would have gone to candidate Trump and shared their concerns about the purported Russian connections of Page and Papadopoulos, which didn't amount to a hill of beans anyway. And it's absolutely certain that both of these no-counts would have been unceremoniously booted from the 26th floor of Trump Tower, with or without a parachute. The plain fact is, Trump didn't know them, didn't need them, and had not said a single word during his campaign based on whatever they were doing, which was actually above board anyway. By the same token, from that screaming abuse of state power, there metastasized the entire RussiaGate narrative, the despicable prosecution of General Flynn for doing his job, and the launch of the Mueller witch hunt designed to remove from the nation's highest office the Trumpian threat to the deep state's rule. Not surprisingly, the Donald has fought back in his patented street-brawling style, but so doing, he has defaulted to policy positions which are no less statist than those of the anti-Trumpers. To wit, his massive defense buildup, unhinged border wars, and all-out trade war assault on China are designed to mobilize and incense his red state political base, not solve any notable national problem, as we document in the pages which follow. At the end of the day, of course, it will be American capitalism, democratic governance, and the prosperity and liberty of the people that will end up the worse for the wear. Still, the deep state coup has visibly failed, and soon the misguided Trumpian protectionist and statist economic agenda will be crushed by the collapse of the giant Wall Street financial bubble and the phony, debt-fueled recovery that was the source of the Donald's temporary sojourn in the Oval Office. We've chosen to label this baleful state of affairs as Peak Trump, and in the chapters to follow, we attempt to explain why it happened and where it goes from here. On the latter score, we claim no clairvoyance about the future whatsoever, but what we do know is that Washington's empire abroad and phony prosperity at home is terminally failing, and that whatever comes next won't be MAGA. Not by a long shot. This has been Peak Trump, The Undrainable Swamp and the Fantasy of MAGA, written by David A. Stockman, narrated by Russell Newton. Copyright 2019 by Contra Corner Press. Production copyright by Spoken Tome Media. You need to hear this.